Within Bible translation, and most of you who've been around for years and you know the type of Bibles that we have in our possession, there's this, what I call, black hole. Everybody gravitates towards, because we have the Latin Vulgate, the most extant and accepted and Latin text. But there are a few witnesses that are not extant behind what are called the Old Latin versions that are not Vulgate. So part of what I did in picking my poison was to try and find somewhere in the old versions. And I did actually found one, which is two-sided, Greek and Latin, but it is not Vulgate. It's the Codex Claromontanus, which dates to approximately like late 6th, early 7th century, but we're going to call it 6th century for right now. We're going to call it on that sliding scale. I want you to catch some dates here. Versus the most complete, the oldest complete extant Vulgate, which dates to the 7th and 8th century, which is, we have a complete copy of the whole thing, the Amiantinus. So I had something to go back and compare when I was looking at the Latin. I had things to compare, and came to certain conclusions regarding the Latin translations, which require even going back further to understand the implications of the Vulgate and how it crept in and permeated. The Vulgate translation, as most of you know, was the product of Jerome, who was commissioned by Pope Damasus in 382, I believe it was, because there were so many Latin versions. If someone could make a translation, there were so many that he was commissioned by, here who commissioned it, a pope. So you've already got some concrete lines as to how this may go. Seeing the timeline of 382, we're talking about the church already being entrenched in church councils. Think about it. I often refer back to this. 325 is the Council of Nicaea, but there were many church councils before that, and many what were called synods and ecumenical gatherings. So by 382, it's safe to say that the Catholic Church has been well tentacleized within Christianity. So the commissioning of this unified Latin translation certainly will come with some baggage, okay? Terminology that would be commonly used within the Catholic Church will automatically be engrafted into this translation. Now, if you read the history of Jerome, and it's not dull by any means. People who think history's dull, they have a problem. Jerome, he had other problems, but I'm talking about people who think that history's dull. But it'd be tantamount to finding someone in a Protestant church to say, do a translation. And if the person truly understands why they are Protestants and how we understand certain scripture, this will be reflected on how you interpret. No matter how good of a linguist and a scholar and a theologian you might be, you're going to have some preconceived notions because of where you've come from. And this is certainly the case. This is not meant as a harsh criticism, because can you imagine undertaking translating the Bible, period, into any language, period? No, thank you. But to have somebody come along and try and translate without bias. So you've got to follow the history to see why sometimes doing these types of things is necessary. Where did this come from? The use of a particular word that shifted along the way. Now, the word we're specifically looking at, confession, it is not so much the modern definition that concerns me. It's what's beneath the word. And as you follow it back, you begin to see that within a period of a few hundred years even, the understanding or the way it was used or perceived or understood changed. Fast forward into modern times, and when you say the word confession, I read you the Webster's Dictionary. The beginning first definition, first line of the definition, has a pejorative, negative connotation to it. Tonight, I hope to show you that if we're going to follow the language stream back, momentarily we have to almost lose English, and by necessity, we almost have to abandon Latin, because we took the word from the Latin frame and the Latin stream right into our language. And we must investigate from the Greek backwards. So from the New Testament backwards. And momentarily abandon English and abandon Latin. That's a must. Now, I'm not the only person to take this approach. I did this on my own. This was my own line of thinking. But when the Walton Polyglot was produced, which we have not only one full copy, but we have two copies of, two full copies. One is the one Dr. Scott colored in. Leave it to him to put a highlighter on that manuscript. God bless you. It's only going to make it worth that much more money because that's his holy graffiti there. But Walton did not value the English language in terms of translation. If you look at the polyglot, there is no English in the polyglot because he found it to be of no value in comparisons of the languages. So I'm using the same technique because I do understand, and probably because of my English being so far down the pipeline for me, I do understand that the language, the English language, being a melting pot, we can clearly see that the word is the same in English and the Latin. So we're pushing those aside for right now. And I'm actually have an English dictionary in my lap. I don't know why, but I'm going to close that. Who knows? I may go to sleep with dictionaries at nighttime. Who knows? So the first thing that I want to look at, and I want to show you some examples, really begin for us, even though I said we're putting aside our English translation, I want to show you the examples. So I'd like you to turn in your Bibles. I'm going backwards. We're going to start in the Old Testament. I want you to turn to Leviticus 5:5. And this is the interesting thing. Your King James, we're in Leviticus 5. It shall be when he shall be guilty in one of these things, that he shall confess that he hath sinned in that thing. I like that they italicize things and thing. Now, if you were reading this in the Septuagint, I'm just tempted for some of you who are so diehard that you're like Thomas. You won't believe it until you see it. I know I've got Thomases out there. I'm a Thomas too. Takes one to know one. Let's see if I can have a camera pick up what this would look like. I'll highlight it for you first. So you can see that is not a homologia word, correct? All right. What we encounter, I have a feeling I'm going to have a lot of marker on my hand tonight. Wasn't lying. All right. What we encounter is this word that we just looked at in the Septuagint, and this stands for the Septuagint. I don't want to write in red right now. So Leviticus 5:5, what was being translated in the King James, I just wrote Septuagint, so we'll stick with that first, so we'll keep a linear movement here. So for Septuagint, we have here the word, and as I said, it looks a lot like another word in the Greek, but it's not related. So this word here, ex agorusai, which is being translated in your King James as confess, shall confess, actually, part of the verb, shall confess. And in the Hebrew, I'm just going to give you the trilateral or the three letters in the Hebrew. Not everybody here is studying Hebrew, so it'll become too taxing to try and show. I want to be consistent. So I will, for the Hebrew, I will define something in a minute. But for the Hebrew, we'll see this word, which is yada. And I'm putting here what I said yesterday. This is in the hith pael. And this, when it is sitting in proper context, this is just the trilateral root as it appears. So what we have is, and I've put a couple of examples. In fact, it's my own chicken scratch. It's my own notes. I'd be happy to make these available to you, at least a few of these that are legible. What we have is immediately when we're confronted with this word, shall confess, we do not have the word homologia at all being used. And we have the Hebrew word hithpael. Now, hithpael is intensive and reflexive. Sometimes it can be indirectly reflexive or directly reflexive. Now, we know what reflexive in English, to make something reflexive, we have to say you do something for yourself. He did something for himself. Directly reflexive is I'm doing something for me, for my benefit. That's directly reflexive. And directly is that I may be doing something myself, but the benefits of the action that I do may spill over to somebody else. It's not reciprocal, it's reflexive. I'm still doing it. The himself or herself portion is there. So when we have the hithpael occur, the majority of the time with this Hebrew verb, what you're going to find for radio people, for yada or yade, you're going to find that it does connote, it does define in some way the concept of what we have labeled confess. But this is where what I'm going to show you tonight gets tough, and that's why showing and giving scripture makes sense. We just looked at Leviticus 5:5. Leviticus 5:5. The same is true, the same word and the same situation, same Greek word, same English word, same Hebrew word will appear in Leviticus 16:21, Leviticus 26:40, Numbers 5:7. I've got, because I was using the Septuagint, in the Septuagint you have 3rd Kings, we have 1st, 2nd, 3rd Kings, 8:31. There's apocryphal literature, Nehemiah 1:6, 9:2, etc. Job 31:34, Psalm 32:5. Now, what I did is to try and show you how we're going to distinguish concepts and words, I picked Psalm 32:5 because they're all the same, but Psalm 32:5 has something particularly of interest. So if you will turn there. This is to try and demonstrate and show you what goes into putting this together. And I should note, when we were in Leviticus 30:34, this is listed in Leviticus as 30:34, shall confess, correct? Now, in Psalm 32 and verse 5, King James reads, I acknowledged my sin unto thee, mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess. So we have two words. I acknowledged my sin. That is a different word, 30:45 for the Strong's people out there. And then I will confess, 30:34 again. Strong's, okay? So, if you look up these words, something very interesting happens. For this word, I acknowledged my sin unto thee, we have a Greek word which is from the gnosis words, from the mind words. And when it's going to confirm what I just said, just like Leviticus 5:5, that same exagoruse word will be used to translate what is Strong's 30:34. I will confess. And I'm going to just throw a wild card in here while I'm on this page. I even I went back to see what the Latin did, just even though I said we're going to leave Latin out of this for a minute, let me just, because I put this on here. Latin, coming from the Vulgate stream, this is why I wanted to leave this out, put cognitum for acknowledge and confitibor for confess. Now, that all means nothing right now. It means absolutely zip. But what does get my attention, good thing I did not bury my Strongs. So, I used a couple of numbers here, 30, 34, and 30:45, which I know what I was looking for. If you take the time to look up the word confess, considering there's all this talk about confess and confession, there's not too many words Here we go. So I'm looking at the Strongs right now. Confess, Leviticus 5:5, Leviticus 16:21, Leviticus 26:40, all the ones that I mentioned that use this Greek word ex agoruse. All right? Numbers 5:7, which uses that same Greek word. 1 Kings 8:33 and 35. These are all, everything that was on my list down there, and I also included some apocryphal references because I was using the Septuagint. Nehemiah 1:6, Job, Psalm 32:5. That's it for the Old Testament for confess. And then you go through confessed, confesseth, confessing, confession. That's it. And if you count the total occurrences, this is what is somewhat perplexing, that you would think if something is so important, it's going to take up a lot of place in the Strongs because it's going to be repeated often. But if you're looking at this, and I'm a visual person, so I hope you don't mind me doing this, but I'll show you from where I'm looking. This is the section, what I'm going to highlight and pick up to show you that I've bracketed is strictly Old Testament references. And wherever you see just a little bit of 3 down here, that's it. Okay. So hopefully you can see this. If you start down here at confess, you're going to see there's not that many references in the Old Testament. Can you see that? And then what's underneath it, of course, is New Testament, and there's not too many of those either. And you come up top here, and I'm reading upside down without glasses, so I think that's still New Testament. Then we have confessed, and there's 2 in the Old Testament. 1, and about 3 or 4 here. Now, if this is important, you would think that the word would spill over everywhere and you'd have pages, or at least a full page of it. Now, that's not the criteria for establishing its importance, but perhaps what is important is that somewhere even behind our English, we're missing something that I not only see in this Greek word, but then it busts open in the Hebrew and becomes clear as to why we ended up with this Greek word translating these particular words, and then another Greek word is used, which I should clarify in case some of you want to go and check. The word homologia will be found one time in Deuteronomy referring to confession of sins. You will not find it in your King James that way. I had to go many manuscripts, and I found it in the Septuagint that way. Just there's some things that you kind of go, why were they just consistent? Well, they weren't. So, end of story. But now, back to where we are. So then, I guess the key thing now is to establish if we have concluded that this word being used in the Greek, you've seen clearly, I just showed you, is essentially translating this 30:34, and that 30:34 is this Hebrew word here, then the next thing I had to see was, remember, English, we're reading confess, profess, confession. How did we get homologia? How does this come to be? So in order to do that, I went back into the Septuagint, and I'm going to do the same reverse thing I just did now, looking at this word. And this is what is going to be mind-boggling to you, was mind-boggling to me. Now, really, I would prefer for you not to have these notes because they're my handwritten notes and they're hard on the eyes. I didn't make them neat and pretty. But I'll start with somewhere. We have to start somewhere. So let's start with this one because it's probably the least important. So when you begin to look up the word homologia, we just saw this Greek word which is being translated confessed, and I'm going to define those words for you too in a minute, but I'd like to just present all the evidence here. So we're first going to start with what first appears in the lexicon for the Septuagint, that is Redpath. This word first comes up, homologein. There are not too many references, and the references I put are not exhaustive. I've just put down 1, 2, 3, 4. And I need these to be clear, so I'm going to use one that we can look up together so you can see what happens. It's going to get interesting. In your King James, it will be Jeremiah 44. If you are using a Septuagint, it will be Jeremiah 51. Don't ask me, I didn't order the books or the chapters that way. But in your King James, it's Jeremiah 44:25. If you're using a Septuagint, it's Jeremiah 51:25. And remember, I'm looking backwards now. Instead of trying to look up the word in an English way or in a Hebrew way, I'm using the Septuagint, and I'm looking up occurrences of this word. So I'm giving you an example with Jeremiah 44:25. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, Ye and your wives have both spoken with your mouths and fulfilled with your hands, saying, We will surely perform our vows. And that for you Strong's people is 5088. That we have vowed, 5087. Remember, these words are being translated in the Septuagint by this word homolegein. Do you understand what I'm showing you, right? Okay. We will surely perform our vows that we have vowed, to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and to pour out drink offerings unto her. You will surely accomplish your vows. There it is again. And surely perform your vows. There it is again. Now, 3 or 4 times, depending on which, if you're using the Septuagint or you're using the King James, but what you will see, and this is what they look like as they appear. Homologias, homologias. Some of these are compound and conjugated or derivatives. And the second one, or third one rather, is just a repeat of number 1. So this is what you're looking at. And you can see this is exactly the same word I've been talking to you about in our New Testament that is describing confession and profession. Now, I'm just giving you some examples so you can see this particular Hebrew word is translating, this Greek word, what's being translated here, is representing this word here in the Hebrew. Wow, I'm just having fun with my pen. Nadar, that is a promise or a vow. So I want you to kind of keep underneath that sometimes concepts that are being conveyed to us, vowing vows, homolegein, vowing vows. And if you really get what this verse 25 is saying, remember I kept saying behavior and belief. I hate to use the word belief, but it makes the point because belief is the mind. This is describing behavior and belief. Ye and your wives have both spoken with your mouths and fulfilled with your hands, saying. So you can see there's something underneath this when I keep saying behavior and belief. This is not instructions on how to. This is looking at what's the undergirding of this particular Greek word, which will be translated, will have several Hebrew words representing this one Greek word. So, if you were looking in the concordance strictly under this word, homolegein, and I'm going to write them, I'll write them again so you can see. Several words will crop out. This is one, but another one that will crop out is a repeat. Yada, praise or thanks. In the hifah and in the hithpel, it is confess. It has a more pejorative, less pleasant meaning to it. Even one time, the proverbial, we look alike but we're not related, yada, which is to know. And sometimes this word, which we actually saw in the translation of our text from Hebrews 4:14, to vow, a vow, to swear an oath, or simply to swear. So these words, if you were looking up in trying to find the Hebrew equivalent of this word, you're finding that these Hebrew words are representative of they're connected to. So that's number one. And not exhaustive. I'm trying to give you examples enough to follow along. We just saw homolegein. Now, homologia. And this is where it gets really good, because we're looking at the word as if we were going through the lexicon together. Homologia. You're going to like this. I actually really like it a lot. Let's see if I can make sure that I wrote it in the, I wrote everything Septuagint or King James. Sometimes I have to check myself. Deuteronomy. Okay, Deuteronomy 12:6. If you want to turn there, I think you should for this one. You are going to say, how could this word crop up? Remember, we just saw it as a vow. That was the example I used, but in my paper here I show that it has carries many different meanings, and I gave you the Hebrew words. So now, Deuteronomy 12:6. And thither you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and your tithes and your heave offerings of your hand and your vows. There's one word. Remember, we just saw it. Well, guess what? If you were reading, might as well do this too. Let me open the Septuagint and read it to you. Más mejor. Or how do you say that? 12:6. Here we go. So here we have the word for, it's not exactly translated the same, by the way, but your free will offerings. So your vows, the Hebrew word we just saw, and your free will offerings, which is the word I'm focusing on, which is being translated by the Septuagint as homologias. Oh, goody. Now, this is all going to kind of look the same in a minute, so bear with me. We just saw that as a free will. Whoops. Free will. And we also saw the word vowed, right? Was in there too. Now, the reason why I'm translating both of these words and showing you their Hebrew, what they are attached to, is this free will word in the Hebrew, and the word for vowed look somewhat similar. So the one for free will, it's tri-consonant root is nadav or nedav, and vowed is nidar. Pretty close, huh? You got to be careful. If you lose a limb here or add too much, you vowed a vow instead of it being a free will offering. All right. So you can see the difference, but within the lexicon, eventually you're going to find that homologia we just saw it in my last example. Vow to vow is being translated as homologia or homologia derivative. And here we have it to represent both a free will and a vow. Boy, you're gonna like this one. So this really kind of conveys, I'm still on this same pattern. This takes a lot of work to bring you to the point where you're going, I see it now. You need the Hebrew underneath to understand what the big deal is. If you were just looking at the word homologia and you were just reading the English, confess, profess, it would be no big deal. But what is underneath it all, underneath this word, you can see how. This is why I emphasize this. It was Jewish scholars who translated the Old Testament Hebrew into the Greek for the Septuagint. So you know that they were specific in using certain words to translate and represent others, which is the mystery of my first Greek word, which is not homologia, which then magically disappears and is not used again. So many doors opening up here. All right. So I want to hit this over the head so you go, I got it, I get it. But I want to use a different example because this same word, nadar, will also be used for Hosea 14:5, where it says, God says, I will love them freely or truly, homologos, same word. But in Ezekiel 46:12, that is Septuagint, I'm not sure that's King James, but I wrote it down here, voluntary burnt offerings or a Thanksgiving whole burnt offering. That is voluntary or thanksgiving out of Ezekiel 46:12 in the Septuagint is being translated homologia, and it is also being represented by yada. So are you now going, wait a minute, how can this be? How can we, but you're going to see these same Hebrew words repeated over and over, except something's going to happen. And what's going to happen is this. When we get into compounds, and I'm not even going to try and write out the compounds. I'm going to write out the Greek, but not the Hebrew, because you're going to go, whoa, okay, I see it now. I'll just hold this up, and it'll be enough for you to say it's making my head spin. When you add the prefix ex, homo, and I'm going to use logain, when you get to that, this will strictly be, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 other Hebrew words, will strictly be translating yada. And the bulk of these are in the hifel, which puts them as praise, laud, thanksgiving, thankful. Now let me hold this up because it's kind of, you might go, wow, what is that? Okay, so this is this represents all of the ones, it's not exhaustive, but all of the references that I put down. And what you see is like 17 and 18 in brackets is Septuagint, King James, because they're off by 1 number. Septuagint is off by 1 number, especially in the Psalms. But if you look down the column, you're going to see all these little like A in a circle. Those are all representing what is in the hifel of this word. So let's get a flavor for what we're looking at, so you can identify visually what this is. Let's look at Psalm 6:5. We're going to flip through a couple of Psalms so you can see a pattern. Psalm 6:5 says, "For in death there is no remembrance of thee. In the grave who shall give thee thanks or praise?" There's your homologia, ex-homologia word. Okay? Then we read, I'll try and stay close. See in Psalm 7 and 17 where it says, "I will praise the Lord according to his righteousness." If you have a Bible like mine, I have some Strong's numbers in here, and it says, "I will praise" is 30:34, yada, in the hifel. So it becomes obvious as you keep building this, and I've, as I said, this is not exhaustive, but I just wrote down enough to show you that this word carries more weight in its derivatives towards praise and even the concept of free will or vow. They don't carry a negative connotation. As to when we get to define the word in English, we begin to weigh down this word with some very heavy concepts that immediately come from the Latin stream. But the undergirdings of, when you're looking at it from the Greek and the Hebrew, the undergirdings, now they're not all positive. When I say positive, not all are in the hifel. Some are in the hithpale, but not very many. So I've covered 1 word, 2 words. Let's do the last one that I dug up, which is still a compound. It is ex homo. And yes, I know that's not true Greek, what I just did there, but it's okay. It's all Greek to me. All right. So what I've done here is I've, from the lexicon, taken this compound, and now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 different Hebrew words representing the same compound. And if you can see what I've done here, A and B are the same. A is in the hifel, yada, and B is related to A too, extension of the hand in adoration or thanksgiving. So as I analyze these, what you end up with is the bulk of these translations have to do with praise. The bulk of the use of this word homologia and its derivatives coming out of the Septuagint, the bulk, not all of them, but the bulk of them, have to do with praise, thanksgiving, vowing vows, free will offerings. These word streams carry with them something that is, it's kind of tough to say this way, but it is behavior and belief attached. You can't make a free will offering. It's voluntary. That means the mind has agreed and the body puts in action going into the pocketbook or into whatever they were free willing back then and gives. Now, what I love about this is if you understand the weight of measuring out how the Septuagint, and now we're going to investigate the Hebrew from simply the Hebrew perspective, without any Greek infringement. And then I'll take you to the Greek Theological Dictionary, so you can see the weight of what this carries. When we begin to encounter the word in the New Testament, we need to change our thinking briefly that it may not carry the concepts that we have so ingrained in our language. Now, that's not to say, I don't want anybody to mistake the idea that do I believe as a Christian and as a believer and as a person who reads the Bible that the concept of confession is non-existent? No, it's there. It must be there. The Day of Atonement, the great Day of Atonement, is a perfect case in point. And when I read Psalm 51, there is the greatest confession of all times against thee, O Lord. My issue is in understanding delicately that which falls into lament and praise, for which this word yada represents both. It's like taking a word and bifurcating it. And the bulk of the bifurcation represents praise and thanksgiving, and some small dimension of it represents confession, lament, but is never far away in the Old Testament. Confession and lament is never far away from the praise. They seem to be attached. So when you read the Psalms and you encounter someone like David in Psalm 51 who is expressing that he has sinned against God, there's also a lament woven in there, and there's also a praise concept because he is wanting to get back to create in me a new heart, restore to me the joy. There's that desire to get back to. So these concepts are not far apart. And when I begin to read the lexicons and the dictionaries, you'll say, okay, I get why she's saying this, the weight of this is overwhelming. Now, how should we interpret this in the New Testament frame? Because the word will, over the span of 300 years, the word homologia will transition ever so slightly. Now, if we're looking at the Septuagint being done to, we'll call it 300, 250, somewhere BC, somewhere around there, to the time of Christ's use, because Christ did use, we know when he read from the scroll, we know he was reading from a Septuagint version of the scroll. When he read Isaiah 61, we can conclude that by the text. A span of, we'll call it 250 years. Would the language usage evolve that much to be that much different 250 years later? Well, you be the judge and look at your English and what has happened in 250 years with certain terms that now, I mean, the dictionary has expanded with words that should have never made it into the dictionary. And words that were once used for one thing are now used for another. So, when we're going to take a break, when we come back, we will keep investigating. I'm planning to be here for a while, so if you're at home, do your phone calls and go to the bathroom or whatever you need to do. And if you're here in the studio and, we'll cut you some slack. About 10 o'clock, we'll let you go to the bathroom. But right now, I need you to get on the telephone, make your reservations, and get your commitments done. That's the big thing right now. Get busy.